Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. How can a much bigger European Union function effectively? Will key national interests be overridden for the benefit of collective decision-making? How do European institutions and budgets need to adapt to a union of more than 30 members? These are some of the big questions that European leaders are currently mulling. My guest today has a comprehensive set of answers. Daniela Schwarzer is the co-rapporteur of a key report, Sailing on High Seas, Reforming and Enlarging the EU for the 21st Century, published in late September. She's a member of the working group convened this year by the French and German governments on reforming the EU. Before that, she was special advisor to the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Daniela Schwarzer joins me from Berlin. Thank you so much for being on the program. Let's start perhaps with the European political community, which met in Granada in the last few days. Do you have any takeaways from that last summit, or perhaps from the EPC process in general? Do you think it's achieved much?
Well, first of all, I think it is good that it exists. It has met for the third time, this time around in Spain. And before that, it met in Moldova. And I think that is remarkable because it travels from EU countries to neighboring countries. So Moldova is officially a candidate to EU accession and is waiting to open negotiations. It is a country that is under huge threat from Russia. And so it was a very strong symbol that at the time more than 40 heads of state and government traveled there and showed that way that Moldova is part of Europe, part of Europe that stands up against Russia's war against Ukraine. And now the meeting in Spain, of which we see the pictures on the screen, is important because it showcased there are so many things to talk about between leaders. This is a forum for the heads of state and government who come together, who have bilateral small group meetings, but also plenary sessions. And the European political community right now doesn't even issue a common statement in the end. But it can be developed into something more substantive. But I would say as a reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine, as a reaction to the fact that the European security order is really destabilized, it's very important to have this kind of dialogue in a very informal setting. And there have been some results in smaller formats, but also with regards to policy debates, in particular in the area of energy.
In your report, which I mentioned in the introduction, you propose that the EU could move forward with 4 concentric circles. So the inner circle, the EU, associate members, and the European political community. Is there a risk that people in this community are going to feel very far away from the core?
Well, maybe they want to be very far away from the core because being only in the European political community at the end of the day will be a choice. This is not a waiting room for countries that want to make their way into the European Union. They would ask for, membership and then negotiate their accession process and can move towards the core. But the European political community is really the place where countries can go who don't share fundamental principles that the EU has put in place, like, for instance, the rule of law. They don't want to create something more political. They just want to be in a dialogue format in a rather loose arrangement where diplomatic conversations can happen, where policymakers meet on the highest level, and that's what it's for.
You talk in your paper, as you mentioned the rule of law just now, and that's something you talk about quite high up in this report, Sailing on High Seas. And you say the candidate countries, so we're talking about EU candidate countries now, not the European political community, but you say candidate countries must speed up their reform process, particularly about the rule of law, which is an essential and basic aspect. How is that process going on the rule of law for the candidate countries, do you think?
Well, the norms are set out clearly in the EU treaty, and they are a subject matter of the negotiation process. It is one of the prerequisites for EU membership, and so every country has to meet those criteria. The problem of the EU is that it has internal issues with implementing those standards. So that's a big issue because, and you asked for how is it going in the candidate countries, the EU itself has to demonstrate very clearly that it is serious about those principles. By the way, if it doesn't respect them, it undermines the single market, which is essentially an integrated market, but based on European law with direct application on the member state level. Some countries that are, already negotiating, they are actually backsliding. Look, for instance, at what is happening in some Western Balkan countries. So we have to be very clear. This is a principle that needs to be applied.
Do you think the EU is sending the wrong signal to the candidate countries if it doesn't uphold the rule of law in the existing EU member states?
Absolutely. And that's one of the major weaknesses at the moment. The EU has to make sure it is credible in two regards. One is on rule of law and the principles that you find in the Article number 2 of the EU treaties, which concern, for instance, human rights and other very fundamental standards. So it must be credible on that, because if it is not, how can you tell candidate countries that they should be complying by those norms? And the other thing that the EU has to be credible on is its own reform process. It needs to get ready for enlargement, and you can't expect candidate countries to push ahead with reforms if they don't believe that they will actually enter the club.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that topic of EU enlargement and particularly how you make decisions with 35 or 36 members. We saw this, we saw last Friday a disagreement between Poland and Hungary and other EU member states on how key decisions on migration should be made. Of course, Poland and Hungary want that decision to be unanimous, but it's actually happening by majority voting. I suppose if you've got an EU of 35, 36 members, unanimous decisions means nothing would happen. There would be blockages all the time.
That risk is indeed very high. I think one important thing to bear in mind is that qualified majority voting is already the standard procedure in many areas where the EU passes laws. And the question is not to change that at all, but to keep that in place. But already there, Poland and Hungary have issues, and other countries may raise that question as well. I think it is an absolute prerequisite that what we have achieved in terms of joint decision making and including qualified majority voting stays in place. But we also know the bigger the EU gets, and the more it may actually do other things in areas where there is not yet a competence for the EU. It is important to have efficient decision making.
So in any treaty change, could some countries, let's say Poland or Hungary, block any attempt to increase the use of majority voting? So they would actually stop the EU moving to that kind of decision making that could disadvantage Poland or Hungary in the long term?
First of all, in order to extend qualified majority voting, we don't even need a treaty reform, but we still need a unanimous decision. So even without touching the treaties, they can block this.
Right.
And that is why we suggest in our report that if there is a group of countries that wants to move ahead, deepening their cooperation in a specific policy area, wanting to introduce qualified majority vote there, this should be possible.
So then that's where you get the multi-speed Europe, isn't it? Then you have perhaps a core of countries that are willing to move with that, what you just said, and others that don't.
Yes, and that's very much a reality already in the EU. We have that with the euro. Not all EU countries are part of the euro. It's only 20 out of 27. We have that with the Schengen area, where you can essentially travel without a passport and have a more integrated space for citizens. So there is a good practice already. The important thing is when we think about more differentiated integration, we should make sure this happens within the institutional framework of the EU and in compliance with the treaties. Because if that is not assured, we will lose the contribution that these institutions definitely make to the ability of member states to work together effectively.
And in this report, you also talk about the implications of enlargement of a much bigger EU for key policies of the EU, cohesion policies, for example, agriculture. I mean, does an enlarged EU require completely different thinking on the EU budget?
It does. Our mandate of the group was to just look at the institutions. And we felt, although, that's set out very clearly in a letter by the two ministers, we said, look, we have to also about those questions. And since we delivered our report, we saw that the debate is really shifting towards those politically even more complicated questions of reforming EU policies and making them fundable, because we are thinking, when we speak about enlargement now, there could be 7, 8, even 9, 10 countries joining. And so the policies need to be reviewed, but not only because the number of members is growing, but because the challenges for the EU have really grown. We are now in a very much more geopolitical context. Geoeconomic challenges are facing the EU. We have to think more about our own competitiveness and many other things. And the policies that we are now talking about that are so costly, common agricultural policy and cohesion policy, they were created a long while ago. The questions are now different ones. We are managing a digital and ecological transition, and that has to happen in a way that is compatible with the idea of cohesion. That's a very new challenge. So we really need that review, and it will be politically difficult. And we have to also think about new funding sources for the EU.
Just briefly, Daniela Schwarzer, we're almost out of time, but if I could ask you to look into your crystal ball, do you think enlargement will actually be in place by 2030, as, for example, the president of the EU Council has set out as a goal?
We also mentioned that date, but we say not for enlargement, but for the EU to be enlargement ready. That's our homework. The candidates have to advance with their own preparations, and it's very important to have a very clear target. Right now, the ball is being played from one side of the field to the other, saying, you're not getting ready, you're not getting ready. So this clear commitment by the EU to say, we will get this done in 7 years, is a good and strong signal to the candidate countries.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Daniela Schwarzer, joining me from Berlin. That's all for part one. After the break, my colleague Douglas Herbert will be asking his guests in Brussels some tough questions following recent migrant tragedies in the Mediterranean.